I was being brought to set in a wheelchair. Like, I couldn't walk that far. So I had to tell everybody because I needed help. You know, I needed someone to help me stand, and I needed someone to help. I needed someone to help me to get there.
There are stories from Hollywood that never quite make it to the surface. Stories that live in the spaces between takes, in the quiet conversations that happen off camera, in the bonds that form between people who spend years working side by side. For decades, one of those stories belonged to Christina Applegate and Ed O'Neill. And now, after a reunion that nobody expected to hit quite as hard as it did, Christina has finally stopped holding back. What she has shared about her former TV father is not a scandal. It is not a takedown. It is something far more powerful than either of those things. It is the truth about what it actually looks like when one person in this industry genuinely protects another. And the more people hear it, the more they realize how rare that truly is. When Christina Applegate and Ed O'Neill appeared together publicly after years of separate careers and personal hardships, the reaction from fans was immediate and emotional. People who had grown up watching Married with Children felt something shift in their chests the moment they saw those two people standing near each other again. But what most of the audience was watching as a nostalgic moment was actually something much more loaded for the two people living it. Christina had already gone public with her multiple sclerosis diagnosis in 2021, a moment that shook her fanbase and the broader entertainment community. She had been honest about what the disease had taken from her physically. She had spoken about the cognitive fog, about needing a cane to walk, about having to relearn what her body could and could not do. And through all of it, she had mentioned, in various interviews and conversations, that certain people from her past had shown up for her in ways she did not expect. Ed O'Neill was at the top of that list. But she had never gone into full detail. Until recently. After the reunion brought their connection back into the public eye, Christina opened up in a way that felt different from anything she had said before. Less guarded. More willing to name exactly what Ed had meant to her and exactly what he had done. What came out was a portrait of a man that the public had never fully seen, and a relationship that went far deeper than anyone outside their circle had understood. Christina was 15 years old when she walked onto the set of Married with Children in 1987. She has talked about that fact before, usually in the context of how young she was, how much she was taking in, how surreal it felt to be thrown into something that controversial at that age. The show was provocative by design. The character of Kelly Bundy was written as a teenage sex symbol, which meant that from the very beginning, a very young girl was surrounded by material and attention that required someone experienced to manage carefully. Ed O'Neill was in his early 40s at the time. He had come up through theater. He understood the industry and he understood people. And according to Christina, he made a decision early on that he was going to look out for her whether anyone asked him to or not. What she exposed after the reunion was not one dramatic moment. It was a pattern. A consistent, years-long pattern of quiet protection that most people on the outside never noticed because it was never performed for an audience. Ed would position himself between Christina and conversations that were heading somewhere inappropriate. He would speak up when producers pushed for things that made her uncomfortable. He would check in with her between scenes, not as a formality, but because he actually wanted to know how she was doing. She talked about how he would sometimes call her mother directly, just to let her know that her daughter was being looked after. Think about what that means for a moment. This was a working actor on a hit television show, taking time out of his day to call the parent of his teenage co-star and say, without being asked, that he had her back. That is not something the industry produces naturally. That is a person making a deliberate choice about who he wants to be. One of the most striking things Christina revealed was how much of their relationship existed entirely off the record. There were no cameras capturing the moments that meant the most to her. There were no publicists crafting the narrative. It was just two people, one of them young and figuring out who she was, the other experienced enough to understand what she needed. She spoke about late nights on set when Ed would make sure she had a safe way home. She talked about him teaching her how to handle herself in rooms full of people who did not necessarily have her best interests in mind. He taught her, she said, not through lectures but through example. He showed her what it looked like to hold your ground without making enemies. He showed her what it meant to be professional without being cold. The improvisational nature of Married with Children played a role in this too. The show gave its cast significant freedom to experiment with their performances, and Ed used that freedom as a teaching tool. He would change his delivery mid-scene to see how she would respond. He would give her something unexpected and then watch to see if she could find her footing. These were not attempts to throw her off. They were investments in her development as an actress. He was deliberately making her better because he believed she had something worth developing. Christina has said that those informal lessons shaped her entire approach to performance. The instincts she developed under that kind of spontaneous pressure carried her through projects that had nothing to do with Married with Children. She brought those skills to films, to other television roles, to every room she walked into as an actress. Ed O'Neill built something into her that stayed long after the show ended. Married with Children ran for 11 seasons and ended in 1997 without a proper farewell. No finale that gave the characters a send-off. No celebration of what the show had accomplished. One day they were filming and the next day they were not. For a cast that had essentially grown up together, that kind of abrupt ending left a strange emotional gap. Christina has described that period as disorienting in a way that is hard to articulate to people who have not lived it. You spend years building a routine around a group of people. You celebrate with them, you struggle with them, you become someone in part because of who they are. And then a decision gets made in an office somewhere and the whole structure just disappears. What she exposed after the reunion was that a relationship with Ed did not disappear when the set went dark. They stayed in contact. He followed her career not as a passive observer but as someone who genuinely cared about where she was headed. When she had successes, he acknowledged them. When she went through difficult stretches, he checked in. The dynamic had shifted from mentor and student to something more equal, but the care underneath it had never changed. She also talked about what it felt like to watch him find a new generation of fans through Modern Family, to see him win awards, to watch the world fall in love with Jay Pritchett the way an earlier generation had fallen in love with Al Bundy. She was proud of him in the specific way that comes from actually knowing a person rather than just admiring their work. She knew what had gone into it. She knew who he was when the cameras were not rolling. When Christina announced her MS diagnosis in August 2021, she had no script for how the people in her life would respond. Illness has a way of revealing character very quickly. Some people step forward. Some people step back. Some people say the right things but disappear. Some people say very little but never leave. Ed O'Neill fell firmly into the last category. Christina has been specific about this. He did not send a form message. He did not make a public statement designed to be seen. He reached out privately, directly, and with the kind of honesty that comes from someone who has known you long enough to skip the careful language and just say what is true. What she exposed was that his response felt exactly like every other moment of support he had given her over the decades. Consistent. Unperformed. Rooted in genuine care rather than obligation. He was doing in 2021 what he had been doing since 1987. Looking out for her. Making sure she knew she was not alone. She also talked about the conversation they had regarding any future reunion of the Married with Children cast. Ed made his position clear without hesitation. He would not participate in any version of a reunion that worked around Christina rather than with her. She was not optional. She was not a logistical problem to be solved. She was the point. If the family was coming back together, all of them were coming back together, on terms that she could manage, and a format built around what she needed. That was not a negotiating position. That was a statement of values. When Christina walked onto the Emmy Award stage in January 2023, cane in hand, the audience rose before she had said a single word. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly a full minute, which by any measure is an extraordinary thing to witness in a room full of people who have seen a great deal. She made a joke about it, because that is who she is, and the audience laughed through what were clearly tears for many of them. What most people watching at home did not see was what happened in the conversations that followed throughout that evening. Christina has spoken about how that night became a kind of accounting of her relationships in the industry. People she had worked with years earlier came to find her. Old connections that had been maintained only loosely suddenly felt very immediate. The warmth she received was not the performed warmth of a public event. It felt, she said, like people were telling her something real. Ed was part of that evening in the way he had always been part of the significant moments in her life. Present. Steady. Not making a scene of his own presence but making sure she felt it. This is the detail that has consistently emerged from everything Christina has shared about him. He does not need credit for what he does. He is not looking for recognition for being a good person. He just is one, quietly and persistently, and the people who have benefited from that over the years are the only audience he has ever seemed to care about. There is a version of this story that could have been told as a Hollywood fairy tale. The beloved show, the dysfunctional family that turned out to be real, the bond that survived decades and illness and change. That version is not wrong exactly, but it misses the texture of what Christina Applegate has actually been saying. What she has exposed about Ed O'Neill is something the industry rarely produces and almost never sustains across the kind of time span their relationship has covered. She has described a person who made consistent choices, over and over, across decades, to prioritize someone else's well-being over his own convenience. Not once. Not in a grand gesture. But in the accumulated weight of small decisions that nobody was keeping score of. She was 15 when this started. She is in her 50s now, dealing with a chronic illness that has reshaped her life in ways she never anticipated. And the through line connecting those 2 points is a man who decided, without being asked and without expecting anything in return, to be genuinely present for her. That is what the reunion brought to the surface. Not nostalgia. Not a publicity moment. Something closer to a reckoning with what it means to have been truly seen and protected by another person in a world that is not built for that kind of care. Christina Applegate did not expose a scandal when she talked about Ed O'Neill. She exposed something rarer. She exposed the real thing. And after everything she has been through, she clearly wanted people to know that it exists, that it mattered, and that it still does.